All right. Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining. And welcome to my talk entitled Bring the Climate Impact of Electricity Back to Reality. My name is Trevor Hinkle. My info here is a bit obscured by my video, but I manage the electricity map team at Tomorrow, a climate tech startup based in Copenhagen. So today we'll talk about a few things. First, I'll just introduce Electricity Map and Tomorrow and our vision around climate and energy, and of course how that plays into sustainable digital infrastructure as focused on by the SDIA. Then I'll talk about the idea of how we measure the climate impact of electricity now. This is something very important to our work, especially at Electricity Map. Then I'll go over what we see as some of the flaws in this system, and then I'll put forward a proposal, which we've already started putting into action with some of our partners for a new way of measurement that we think can ultimately drive further climate action, particularly in the context of digital infrastructure. So to start out, just a bit about us, Tomorrow. This is the Tomorrow part of the Tomorrow team. We are a group of technologists with passion about climate change. And for the past couple of years, we've been really digging into this topic. And as you can see, many of us come from large and small tech companies and a variety of backgrounds. But what we share is a passion for solving climate change and with technology and unscalable ways. So, I'm sure many of you have seen a graph like this before, but I think, in many of our talks, we like to bring it back to the kind of ultimate point of why we're doing this, and that's that climate change is, as we see it, the biggest challenge of our time. The data, as you can see from this classic chart on ppm, is undeniable, and we've written extensively about this and our perspective on this point. And specifically, energy, of course, is a big aspect of our climate impact, and frankly, we're addicted to fossil fuels. And this is something for many, many years. And it's only, the production and consumption of fossil fuels, though, things related to COVID have affected trends in some way. And, we're starting to see more optimistic projections, even from the, legacy energy companies, oil companies, about changes here. There's still a lot of fossil fuels in our energy system right now. And it's one of the, if not the largest contributor to CO2 and to climate change. And this is a quote that we love and really speaks to the way we're thinking about climate change of tomorrow from Greta, is that, the real danger is when there is nothing but clever accounting and creative PR as opposed to real action happening. And so a lot of our work and our perspective on climate change at Tomorrow, whether about electricity map or with our other projects, is around creating a shared language for how we can describe real action as opposed to greenwashing and spinning impact. Spinning is not the answer. We need something that is, going to show a meaningful change. So to that end, our first product Tomorrow was electricitymap.org, which maps the electricity emissions of the world in real time. And we've been lucky enough to get a lot of exposure with this project. I've been working with it since 2017, at first as a contributor and then joining the Tomorrow team. And we're really excited about how it's used in the private sector, which I'll explain a bit more about later, give some examples, but also how the public-facing visualization is used by classrooms, on television, universities, by policymakers, energy ministries, some world leaders even. And then finally, that it's been a collective effort. We have an open source community that helps us find the data that goes on Electricity Map, and we owe so much to them to be able to have such a robust database and visualization. So just briefly about what Electricity Map is behind the visualization. We have a data pipeline which ingests public data, and again, we work with an open source community to find this data. We then apply an algorithm called flow tracing, which accounts for the origin of electricity and uses this idea of a linear system to account for the imports and exports of electricity between different grids. And this is particularly important when you're looking at Europe, which is a very interconnected system. If you don't account for the imports and exports, then it's hard to get a complete picture of what's coming out of your plug. And the last thing I'll say is that we have then, on top of this, built another layer called the marginal origin of power and carbon intensity, the marginal unit of consumption and production. And so this is basically a measurement, a model of, if I change my behavior in the grid, how will that affect the grid from a power breakdown perspective? How will the generation and production change? And also, how will the carbon intensity then change as a result? How green will the grid be? Or, how will the grid's impact change based on my actions? And this also utilizes this flow tracing methodology, which you can read more about in this link below, to account for the imports and exports. So that's a bit what we've done. I'm going to now talk a bit about this idea of the climate impact and bring this back to reality. So I'll start with a case study. So recently there was, and some of you may be familiar with this, there was a wind farm in the Netherlands in which Microsoft bought up the production of the wind farm to supply their data center locally. And on the face of it, there's a new wind farm in the Netherlands. This is good news for the grid. The Netherlands is not the greenest grid in Europe, and so there's some positive implications to having a wind farm on this grid. The problem here, though, is that the local citizens felt a bit slighted. They thought, well, there's a big data center that's getting all of this green electricity. What about us? This was marketed as powering over 300,000 households, but what about us? And this, I think it's hard to argue that this, having this wind farm here wasn't a positive development. And so I think the question becomes, how do we describe this? What is our framework for describing how this action by Microsoft, Vattenfall, the people running the wind farm, and their interchange with the community, how does this really affect the grid? In this case, they're buying the right to the electricity, but they don't necessarily control the way electrons are going. And so at the end of the day, a lot of this power may still end up going to these households, which thought that it was going to the data center. So there's this kind of irregularity or a reckoning between the way looking at electricity markets and who's buying and selling the rights to electricity and the kind of physical realities of the grid. And this is something we think about a lot at Tomorrow. And so the question here becomes, how do we measure the impact, the additionality? You think about it in terms of, we talk about additionality and carbon offsets as well, the additionality of this action, and who is getting the benefit here, and how do you best describe what happens and kind of assign responsibility and things like that. It's a challenging case. So to take a step back, this is kind of, as we see it, the way the world can and does measure the climate impact of electricity use from, say, an accounting perspective. And this is key because we really believe, accounting isn't always the sexiest topic, but we do believe that it's a really important, in this case, a framework to be able to take climate action within the context of electricity and other aspects of your carbon footprint as a business or entity or a nation. So anyway, we have kind of two basic kinds of accounting. We have attributional accounting, which is basically saying how much carbon have I emitted as a result of my consumption in a given period. So we have two main approaches. We have the location-based approach, which is basically saying, how can we most effectively capture the physical flows of electricity and what is coming out of the plug and that I am plugged into in the kind of metaphorical sense, with a big company in a data center, for example. And this is what electricitymap.org in our database is trying to model, is the location-based carbon footprint, average carbon intensity of the grid at any given time. Now, the other side of another way to look at attributional accounting is the market-based approach, which essentially says that we have the mix, the electricity mix. Then we have some actors who are buying some kind of certificate product, so usually guarantees of origin or RECs, depending on where you are, and then they will claim responsibility for that product, and so they can say they're 100% green, and then those who have not bought certificates are left with what's called the residual mix, which is essentially if you take out all the electricity from those certificates, then you're left with whatever is left, basically, and that's what the other actors in the market can, or in the area can, or the grid can claim. So if you look at these two approaches with the Microsoft example going back, so in this case, we have Microsoft building a wind farm in this area. From the location-based approach, then the changes in the grid, the responsibility of that is basically shared by Microsoft and by, for whatever amount they consume, and by anyone who's living there and getting power electrons through their grid, through their plug. Then if we look at the market-based approach, Microsoft in this case has essentially bought all of the, has bought the rights to this power. So they can say they're 100% green, and then the consumers are left with the residual mix, which means that, this is a very simplified example. I don't mean to imply that these numbers here reflect the case in the Netherlands. It's just an illustrative, simplified example. But let's say it did, then they would be left with 100% coal, or basically whatever is left on the grid. And that kind of speaks to, I think, the concerns of the locals, is that they have this perception that contractually they are left with a dirtier grid. But the physical reality is the location-based attribution method, and essentially saying that actually, because this wind farm was built, everything, the entire grid is a little bit greener, and we can all, in a sense, share in that. Now, quickly looking at the other side of things, there's also this idea of consequential accounting, which is this idea that basically how much impact am I having? How much is my project, a new wind farm or change in consumption, how much CO2 is that avoiding? And this is essentially a measure of additionality, which, as I mentioned in the case study, is a difficult thing and not really very well captured by the current, especially market-based regimes here. And so this is what we've built a model for with our marginal carbon intensity and power production. But essentially, this takes a look at two different scenarios, whether I consumed as an entity or I did not consume, and looks at two different scenarios and sees the difference. And that's essentially what's on the margin. So it is, what is the incremental increase or decrease in carbon footprint of the grid based on my consumption? So this is essentially an impact measurement. And I think now it's important to say, with the context of carbon accounting, probably the most well-known scheme here is the GHG protocol and their scopes. And within scope 2 electricity accounting, which is what's kind of relevant here, both if you look at the attributional side, there's the location-based and market-based approach. Either approach is okay, which means that you as a company could choose to choose the location-based approach. In this case, then you could say that your impact is based on what's coming out of the plug, basically, from electricity perspective. Or you could use the market-based approach and say your impact, let's say you bought enough certificates or PPAs or RECs, is zero, potentially, despite what's coming out of the plug. Now, marginal is specifically not allowed under and this idea of consequential accounting is not allowed under the GHG protocol. And this is because basically there's some double counting risks and there's a variety of reasons, but this is not something that's currently allowed to be put under the scope 2 accounting side of things. And maybe I'll explain a bit more later about how that's important. So just to highlight this difference between, if we look specifically in attributional accounting, what's in the scope 2 electricity consumption. We have the location-based view, and this is 2017 data from Electricity Map. Maybe we should update these soon. It's been a few years now. So on the left, you see the average carbon intensity of the grid from the location-based perspective. Then we did an analysis where we took green contracts that have been bought and sold out of the grid to see what is the residual mix. So again, if you go back, what are the consumers left with? And you can see that there are, a number of countries that are darker, meaning higher carbon intensity on electricity map as a result. So essentially, this means that those almost without the ability to buy, these certificates, or who have not end up with, from market-based perspective, a higher carbon footprint of electricity consumption. So to just show a different case study that illustrates some of these risks in another way, let's take an example of, as a Norwegian citizen, let's say I'm buying an EV. And the reason I'm doing it is because I see the Norwegian electricity is mostly hydropower. So I think, well, it's very clean electricity, therefore I'm reducing my impact. But if you look at the, again, residual mix from a market-based perspective, Norway has actually sold most of their certificates throughout Europe to, let's say, a data center company and somewhere else who wants to be 100% green. And Therefore, the residual mix as an EV owner, if we use this market-based approach, is actually quite high carbon intensity. And so I'm actually not as clean as I think. And so if I'm looking at it from a market-based perspective, the European data center company who, let's say, bought these certificates will say, well, I'm 100% green. And then I might look at it from a location-based perspective and see that what's actually coming out of the plug is mostly hydro in Norway. And I'll say, well, I'm also pretty green as well. And you come up with this double counting problem that you can't really rationalize these across borders. And you end up with a lot of situations where multiple actors are claiming the same impact or change, or rather the same responsibility for carbon, low carbon electricity. So to kind of summarize these challenges with the market-based system, firstly, we have double counting, which was illustrated by that last case study, and also the idea of being able to measure the carbon footprint across sectors. Market-based, as I say here at the bottom, it ignores the physical realities of the grid. You can buy across borders, and you don't have to account for imports and exports necessarily in the same way as you do with location-based accounting and measurement of electricity production, consumption, and therefore emissions. And so it can be harder to then rationalize across a larger system, say the EU, the carbon footprint that everyone is claiming responsibility for with this kind of double counting challenge. And you see this come up, there's so many situations that you can fall into this double counting trap. Then we have this idea of conflating responsibility and impact measurements. Now, what you are doing, as we see it, with market-based schemes such as PPAs and RECs, is you are providing financial support to a project, a renewables project, or a power plant. And it is very difficult to show the additionality of this. We don't have many established measures. These marginal models that we've been talking about could be one way to go, but it is very difficult to show that this is making that the exact difference that you're making here. Maybe, especially with the given prices of renewables these days, you may be having this happen already. But unless it's, you're on a kind of closed system and you're supporting something that is directly feeding power only to your something where you are consuming, then it's hard to claim 100% responsibility for that. As we see it, what you're really doing is a climate impact strategy. So it's something like buying offsets, planting trees. You are doing something somewhere else that could be a very impactful and positive change in the system. As I said, it's difficult to measure, but that doesn't mean it's not impactful. But you can't necessarily claim all of it as your responsibility of your consumption, because it's not you who may be consuming this power literally, through the electrons coming through the plug. So the way we see it, market-based, these schemes are really interesting and powerful, and we've seen how it's accelerated the renewable transition. They're powerful impact tools, but as an accounting tool, it's a bit suspect because of all the issues, double counting and the challenges of additionality. Now, then on the other side, if you look at the kind of what is accounting for, it's assigning responsibility. It's being able to speak this language of how do you split out responsibility for all these things, and how can it add up to the whole system, add up to 100%. So this is where we see location-based schemes becoming, location-based accounting becoming more relevant, because it allows the ability to allow all the actors in a system to effectively take responsibility. It can all add up to 100% of the system. Then, as I said before, there's difficulty in measuring the additionality of market-based schemes, such as RECs, PPAs. What would have happened if you had not supported this project, whether it's through PPA or guarantees of origin, RECs, etc.? It's very hard to measure that. There's lots of things that we can do, and this is where, again, the marginal models come in. But this isn't often, at least historically, used too much. It's not something that at least I've seen us diving too deep into when we talk about the impact. It's more that the purchaser and purchasee are kind of claiming that the impact is there, and implicitly this project wouldn't have happened without that, and that may not be true. And then finally, there is an inherent risk in this system is that it ignores the physical reality of the grid. And so that leads back to double counting issues. That leads back to at some point, there might be some situation where I, as a consumer, look around and I see all these services that I use advertising themselves as 100% green. But the reality is that they are buying, market-based, RECs, GOs, PPAs, etc. And then I see some information about my own grid and I see it's not 100% green. And there's a reckoning here. And it's, frankly, a reckoning with physics. And so there's, compliance and future regulation risks here. And this is kind of the overarching problem that we see is that there's physical realities of the grid that we can't ignore. And if we can have a system that respects those realities of how electricity is flowing across borders, where generation and production is, then we can have a more actionable framework for action, I guess. So the framework that we would propose for how to bring this climate impact electricity measurement back to reality, as you could say, the physical reality. And I have these steps, and it's not necessarily say one is more than the other. They're kind of two parallel steps. One is taking responsibility, so kind of clean up your own house in a sense. So we would recommend taking the location-based approach to see what is coming out of the plug, and this is your carbon accounting, your scope 2 accounting, basically. And what you get out of this is something that, again, there's not risk of double counting. You can also reflect the positive changes that may have happened on the grid as a result of, saying building a new power plant, and this is on the marginal side. You can reflect that as a benefit for everyone. So going back to the first case study of Microsoft and the Netherlands, what you could frame it as is that they have benefited all of the Dutch grid because of the wind farm that they have supported, and it has lowered everyone's carbon footprint of consumption, which is what the location-based approach reflects. Then the other side, and to be clear, this impact side, this is outside the accounting structure. This is a separate. This isn't how you would be calculating your total footprint. It's a separate measurement. This is how can we impact the world overall? How can we reduce emissions in the world overall? And this is where the marginal approach comes in. So how can we use models of the additional, how will the grid change if I change my behavior, my actions, build a new wind farm? And then I can look all over the world and I can say, what can I do? Where can I build a new wind farm? How can I change my consumption rather, to reduce CO2 as much as I can? But it's not reducing my CO2, it's reducing the world's CO2. And any reduction in CO2 that could be reflected back to me would be captured with point one, the location-based accounting. And that's where that would be captured, but just my share of it. So to expand on this idea of impact activities, there's a few areas that this can be done, and I'm getting a bit low on time, so I'm gonna move through this a bit more quickly. We have time-based and geography-based load shifting and optimization, so changing my electricity consumption based on the carbon intensity of the grid. And that load shifting can impact everyone from a marginal perspective, if you measure from a marginal perspective, and it can also lower your location-based average carbon intensity. Excuse me. Then trying to add more additionality to market-based approaches like PPAs, GOs, RECs, thinking about geographic and physical constraints when we're doing this. So trying to bring it closer to reality, time constraints as well. So there's the geographic, the physical reality, and also the temporal reality. So considering this to have another layer of kind of actionable information and information about the impact, marginal impact of these tools. And there are probably others that I'm missing, and I think this is an area where we can do a lot of interesting innovation in terms of impact activities. So we've done some work at Electricity Map with Google to do this, to put a framework like this in action. So I'm running very short on time, but basically we have helped them with setting their 24/7 carbon-free energy goal. So this is essentially looking at the location-based footprint and how they can reduce that footprint by consuming from carbon-free sources. So consuming in grids and helping green the entire grid as opposed to just the part that, say, Google is consuming or the plants that Google is supporting in that grid. And then we're also looking at the impact side, which is optimization of time of use of electricity. So they're optimizing the compute on their data centers based on the carbon intensity of the grid using our data. So in summary, the way we account for the climate impact of electricity has inherent flaws, and it's presenting major risks for climate action and also PR risks for companies as you come into a reckoning with physics and with the grid. And if we disaggregate responsibility and impact measurements and also better measure the additionality and have some kind of innovation around measurement and tracking of additionality of impact activities, then from our perspective, this leads to a much faster transition to a zero carbon grid and ultimately to our goal of solving climate change. And yeah, that was it. And I'm happy to now answer any questions you have and go into depth in any of these points. Thank you.